Nehru came to power in 1947 and was the Prime Minister of India because Mahatma Gandhi wanted him to be the Prime Minister, though he did not have the majority support in the Congress Party. I will leave that aside. But when he became the Prime Minister, he was handed over a treasure trove. When I say a treasure trove, because at that time in 1947, China was embroiled in a civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang, and the Japanese military had been destroyed by two atomic bombs thrown on them by the Americans. India was the only viable power in Asia at that time. And instead of grasping that situation, which was a godsend opportunity to him, he frittered it away. Bear in mind, gentlemen, that at time in 1947, India had a steel plant which had been set up by Jamshedji Tata. India had an automobile factory, cars were being manufactured in India, and an aircraft factory at Bangalore, which was servicing the American C-47s. India had a massive rail network. At that time, I think it was about 30,000 miles, built by the British, which connected all parts of India from Dibrugarh to Madurai and from Pathankot to Madras. A massive network of roads, rails, everything was there, infrastructure was there. And India should have at that time taken the lead to dominate the world. But Pandit Nehru frittered it all away. It was like a fairy giving you a gift or a genie from the bottle coming out and say, "Hey master, here's a gift," and you say you don't want it and you throw it away. He had a vast sense of history, and his thinking was colored in favor of the minorities. There's so many other facts, but I'm going to discuss a few of these to show that what Nehru actually was. Having inherited such a massive fighting machine, which is the finest military machine in Asia, Nehru just threw it away. In 1947, I think, the chief of the Indian Army went with a proposal to Nehru for the reforms to be initiated. On reading those reforms, the proposal, Nehru was so infuriated, he just threw it away and said, "I don't want the army, I don't want it." And the CNC, the commander-in-chief, who was a Britisher, I think it was General Blucher, he just went away. He says, "Okay, that's up to you to decide." At that time, the Kashmir War had not commenced. It was a godsend that the tribals invaded Kashmir and the Indian army had to move in. Otherwise, there was every chance that he would have disbanded the army. I mean, he was a man without any strategic thinking. He didn't know anything. I mean, that's all I can say. Now, I'm discussing basically his China policy. He inherited a territory from the British Raj, which was the largest territory which India ever had. At that time, the Raj extended from Aksai Chin to the Northeast Frontier Agency and covered the whole of India. I think he had no idea of strategic or global strategy or strategic domination. He didn't know about it. All he understood was, all his life, what he had been doing was following Gandhi in having a non-violent, pacifist approach to everything. Even the British, I mean, I'll talk about it later, were very happy with Gandhi. They were very happy with him, because I remember one of the members of parliament, once writing and saying that the best policeman we have got in India is Gandhi. And he's our supporter. I will leave that out. I'll discuss it in a different video. But now let me concentrate on Nehru. Nehru frittered everything away. The 1913 Shimla Agreement, which was signed, which was held in Shimla between India, Tibet, and China, their representatives had come, was something to be built upon. He didn't do it. And somehow he had a great fascination for China. I have not been able to understand why he should have that fascination. And he always thought India and China are bye-bye brothers. And he supported China. India, one of the first countries in the world to recognize the People's Republic of China when communist China won the Civil War. But that is a very, very sad stage because immediately after that, Nehru was just flummoxed when the Chinese army invaded Tibet. Nehru never realized that the British for almost half a century had kept Tibet as a buffer between India and China. That was the purpose of the Simla Agreement. The Tibetans appealed for help to everybody. The Americans couldn't come in there because they were as it war weary, and the Indian army could have been sent in. I think Sardar Patel was the deputy prime minister, was in favor, but then he was not assertive. He didn't assert himself at all. And Nehru let the Chinese army roll in. And there are reports, I don't know how far they're true, that at some stage when the Chinese occupation army was in Tibet, he saw that rice was sent from the port of Calcutta to the Chinese army in Tibet through Sikkim. What can you say about this man? In 1954, Nehru visited Beijing, that is at that time called Peking. Chinese had occupied the entire Aksai Chin, almost 35,000 square miles, a very big area. And it beats my imagination and the imagination of historians that Nehru was that time the supremo in India, failed to police or even send a constable to Aksai Chin. In fact, India had no administration there, and NEFA was also very sparsely held. It had no importance as far as Nehru was concerned. Well, gentlemen, the facts had to come out, and I think in 55 or 56 he came to know that the Chinese have built a road from Tibet through Aksai Chin to Xinjiang. He was told by Indian intelligence this has happened. But he just kept quiet about it because he had a warped sense of thinking. He had no concept of world history, about world domination. And I will give him credit that he was basically a philosopher who was a deep thinker, and he was unfit to be the Prime Minister of India, of an emerging power. Despite all the provocations which were going on, Nehru introduced Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, at the 1955 Bandung conference. It beats my imagination why he should go around doing that. He was the man who gave legitimacy to the Chinese. How can you say anything good about this man? Mao Zedong was a very shrewd man. He was looking for global domination, and he was looking to restore the old glory of China. Whereas Nehru was not in that frame of mind at all. He was interested in becoming a great third world leader, forgetting that the third world has to recognize him as a leader first, which nobody recognized him. The Americans were pretty exasperated with him because they had offered a seat in the Security Council to India in lieu of China, because at that time communist China was not a member of the Security Council, but was the nationalists who were in foremost over the members of the Security Council. But Nehru declined that offer. He said, we do not want to become a member of the Security Council at the expense of China. Gentlemen, such a man is supposed to have laid the foundations of India. And he has damned India forever, because I don't think India is going to become a member of the Security Council, at least in this century. That's my view. Because each of the Security Council members, have a veto right before they expand the Security Council. And China is not going to allow India to become a member of the Security Council. They will veto any such proposal, even if the Americans and the French half-heartedly or otherwise put the proposal forward. So that was a big blow to India. And the loss of Aksai Chin, the massive territory, and everything was coming clear. Nehru had come to know by 58, 59 that Chinese have occupied the entire territory, and he was hiding it from the Indian public because he was having very little face to show. At that time, somebody advised him that, India should start making forward posts, against China and occupy whatever little land is left behind. So the Indians started, under instructions of Nehru, to set up some forward posts. But there was no infrastructure, no roads, and the rations and ammunition, etc., were being carried on mules there, while the Chinese had built roads right up to the front. Nehru did not know, he was not aware of what is infrastructure and supply lines in a battle. So he neglected all that. Worse, he played politics with the army. Now, there was in 58 a coup in Pakistan when General Ayub Khan took over, and a little later, General Nevin ousted the civilian government in Burma and took over as the dictator. These 2 points were always rankling him, and he was wondering that there wouldn't be a similar coup in India and he would be overthrown. So he decided to keep the army at a low key, keep it divided, keep the top officer cadre divided, and that's why he appointed Krishna Menon as the defense minister. When Krishna Menon had zero knowledge about defense matters, he knew nothing. He was just playing politics here and there. But he made a very stupid statement in which he said, India recognizes the suzerainty of China over Tibet, but would like that autonomy be there. I mean, how could he dictate autonomy is there? And once you have recognized the suzerainty of Tibet, of China over Tibet, and you say that Tibet is a part of China. Historically, the British had ensured after the Shimla Agreement that Tibet would have a quasi-independent status, would be a buffer between India and China, if treated that way. And now the Chinese army was on the Indian border. At the same time, he did not wish to modernize the army. And in 1955, maybe on a clue from him or whatever it means, Indian President Rajendra Prasad has reportedly made a statement in which he said, India doesn't need the army. We can manage the border with the police force. With this sort of leadership and Nehru keeping this man as the President of India, you can well imagine that India was going to suffer a bloody blow. By this time, China had consolidated their position, and at that time, Mao Zedong wanted a settlement with India because Mao was concentrating on Formosa and the American Seventh Fleet, and he didn't want a fight in India. So he sent Chow and Lai with proposals to India to settle the border. Because Indian maps were showing Aksai Chin as part of India and all that, and the Chinese had already occupied it. So the best thing at that time was, when India was militarily weak, to accept the Chinese proposal. What was the Chinese proposal? Chinese proposal at that time was that they would accept the McMahon line in the east at the border. Why? Because they already accepted the McMahon line with Burma. The border in Burma and China is defined on the basis of the McMahon line, which is accepted by China there. They were offering it to India, also the same thing. But they had a rider, and they said Aksai Chin, which has been part of China, was never part of India for centuries, should now be recognized as part of China. It will be a quid pro quo, and the border will be settled. I think that was the most foolish decision, which Nehru had as I told you, no concept of geopolitics and how to go forward. As it is, the army, he had weakened it. It had not been modernized. It was still running around with a Lee Enfield .303 rifle, the First World War. And though the posts were being set up in certain undemarcated areas, unoccupied areas, the soldiers were being given some 15 rounds of bullets and some rations and rata and dal. And they were going there, sitting there without any other support. These were intentions which were taken to be aggressive by the Chinese because they were thinking, look, we are asking you for a border settlement. You are doing by occupying, setting up more posts in those areas. I think in 1962 beginning, Mao Zedong held a meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party where he told them that Nehru is not agreeing with us, and we have now no choice but to give him a blow to bring his prestige down. Nehru at that time was hiding all the facts from the Indian public, despite the fact, I think in 59 or 60, a big Indian patrol of these Central Police Forces going on a patrol to Ladakh was shot, ambushed by the Chinese, and about 15-20 of the Indian policemen were killed. Nehru didn't react. There's nothing Nehru did. It's on record. I don't have to say anything. He did nothing about it, other than talking some mild, admonition to the Chinese. And then he was thinking that the Indian army. They had no spunk because the generals who were being promoted were the generals who were the yes men. There was General Thapar who was promoted, General Thimaiya. Now Thimaiya, as I told you, I've given you an example what he did, giving his resignation, withdrawing away. General Thapar was made the army chief and the Chinese attack, he didn't know what to do. And even the earlier generals, they were just sitting and having a cup of tea or have a drink in the Chelmsford Club and made no service paper in appreciation to Nehru. Look, the northern border must be guarded. Aksai has been taken over by China. Nothing. And Nehru also was a smug believed that the army is very strong. And he made a very silly statement when we were going to Sri Lanka, which is mentioned in India-China War by Maxwell and also by Brigadier Dalvi in his book, The Himalayan Blunder. He told in the press conference, I have instructed the army to throw the Chinese out. I mean, you can't make a cavalier statement like that when you don't have the military power, you're nothing. This was taken by the Chinese as an act of aggression. And they had a thought that maybe the Americans were instigating the Indians. And tomorrow, if they may attack us. India had no such plans in any case. But that's what they're thinking. And then, I think on 20th October, the Chinese launched a massive attack. And it didn't last long because the Indian army couldn't fight. And Nehru forbade the use of the Air Force because he knew that if the Air Force is used, the war will escalate. And he didn't have the stomach for a war. He was a man who was a pacifist, a Gandhian. I mean, made the head of the Indian executive, and he led India down. Had the Indian Air Force been used at that time, the Chinese attack would have been blunted because India had all the advantages there. But nothing happened, and ultimately 3,000 Indian soldiers died. Gentlemen, bear in mind that the blood of those 3,000 soldiers which died fighting for India is on Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. I don't think he was really bothered anybody died or not died. He was still looking forward to his glory. But that had come down, and now he was in a very pitiable state. And there's a record. He wrote a letter to John Kennedy requesting for military help. He asked for some $10 million, I don't know what amount he asked. It's a massive amount. He wanted weapons. Began to have second thoughts, and then he was assassinated. And the next man who came in, Lyndon Johnson, had other priorities. China was his bigger priority. India had no priority at all. So Nehru, gentlemen, I do not know. I do not see anything good that he did for the country. China is one problem. Kashmir I will discuss in a separate problem. Even on the economic front, he failed badly. He wanted to bring in the Soviet style of economy in India with a 5-year plan and all that. But net result was, moment Nehru died in 64, in 65, 66, a famine was there in Bihar. And just imagine if the Americans at that time had not given India under PL 480, food grains and rice, etc., a million people would have died of hunger. It would have been worse than the Calcutta famine during the World War II, when 2 million, I think, Bengalis died of hunger when the British were ruling India. And Churchill was very happy about it. Gentlemen, Nehru should not be put on a pedestal. He continued ruling because no other opposition was there. And the Indians have a concept of hero worship, the Lord Sahib. Why the British kept on ruling India for 200 years? Because the Indians accepted it, they wanted it. To say they didn't want it is not acceptable to me or to most historians. So many Indians were very happy with the barrage because they gave them economic security. They gave them 100,000 at any time, and they were governing a population of almost 250 million. I mean, there is no comparison, and yet the Indian population was just absolutely pacific. They didn't want to fight. They were happy to live as they are. They believed in karma. Anyway, that's beside the point. What I'm coming to now is that on China, Nehru bungled very, very badly. And now he has put an anchor around the Indian leadership's neck. And his policy of pacifism continued even after he died, right up to when Sardarji was the Prime Minister of India. The attempt was not to antagonize China, that was the policy of India, which was changed by Narendra Modi. Many blame Modi for those 20 soldiers who were killed in the Galwan clash. Yes, it is his responsibility, because he had inherited a policy from the time of Nehru, which he thought was good for some time. And he had 19 meetings with the Chinese President Yi, but he couldn't gauge his mind. And then came the Galwan clash, and now China considers India to be the enemy. Now, that is another aspect. But the point is, he has brought in a change of policy. At least the border infrastructure is being built up. The army is given more prominence. And we have been able to, and he has positioned almost 50,000 troops on the Chinese border. It was unheard of. I will tell you, when I was doing the staff college course, and that time the Congress was in power, we had a study tour of Ladakh, and we asked the deputy GOC, how many troops do we have facing China? He said, we have one division. And I asked the GOC, deputy GOC, how many have the Chinese got on the other side? He said they got 6 divisions. So you can just imagine, gentlemen, this was the position and has remained like that till Narendra Modi came. It's easy to criticize him, say his accent in the English is not good, and there's so many foolish videos being made about him that somebody was sitting at the back and propping him in his address to Parliament, to the US Senate, both the houses. It's laughable, and I think such videos, please do not pay any heed to them. And bear in mind that the Modi government has done the right thing in removing the name Nehru Museum from this. No doubt he was the Prime Minister for 17 years, but 17 years is a bridge too far. He shouldn't have ruled that long. He should have been overthrown way back in 54 or 55 and some other man coming. But the Congress party, which was the best policeman for the British Raj, and they accepted the British Raj, and this was the same party which was singing Glory to the King when they came here, when King George came to India. What can you say about such people? Jawaharlal Nehru was an intellectual, I'll give him that credit. And intellectuals don't make good leaders. He really goofed up on the northern border with China. And his policies saw to it that Nepal is now in the Chinese orbit. I think around 54, 55, Nepal wanted some integration with India. And it was Nehru who turned it down. And the 1962 defeat was so traumatic for him And then there was the Colombo Conference of the Nations, and they didn't back India. They did. I mean, it was so sad. Srimavo Bandaranaike was the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka at that time, and they had a conference in which they tried to mediate between India and China, and they didn't back India. They just, did a wishy-washy job. And at that time, the United States was the only country which came to the Indian rescue, but only partially, because they didn't trust Mr. Nehru. And despite the pitiable letter which he wrote to Kennedy with folded hands, that please help us. Gentlemen, we should not put a man on a pedestal, but analyze what he has done. If at all there is a problem with China now, and it's a very, very serious problem because we have undemarcated border with China of almost 3,000 miles. China doesn't recognize this border, and it is at India's peril to think that they will continue this sort of situation with China for the next 100 years. You have to settle the border, bite the bullet. But Nehru never did it when the offers came to him to settle the border. Chow and Lai came to Delhi, and he spent 7 days there trying to convince Nehru and the other Indian leadership like Acharya Kriplani, Morarji Desai, Katju, so many others, Indian leaders, Govi Ballabh Pant, that please settle the border. Nehru thought he's a greater leader than Mao Zedong. He didn't settle it. And he was the man, he was the supremo, the numero uno in the Indian political horizon. He should have taken a decision. But as I've already mentioned so many times, he had no concept of geopolitics and no strategic sense. Otherwise, he wouldn't have neglected the army. And now, this cat is out of the bag. How are you going to put the cat back inside? You can't put it. Gentlemen, I think I will close now. I had discussed this problem basically to bring to the fact that Nehru did a lot of blunders. And I'll have to talk about his other ills in another video, particularly the economic ills which he did, in which he made India the laggard in Asia, and then his problem of Kashmir and the vociferous tendencies which are still there in India and could well lead to the breakup of India. All these can be traced back to only one man, and that is Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. To say that he spoke good English or a very good accent he had, I mean, all that is irrelevant. And somebody said that he went to England and did his education there in Harrow and all that. Fine, that's good. But just remember, great leaders who have shaken history, Abraham Lincoln, Stalin, Mao Zedong, they never went to school. And they led the country, and they are now the makers of their nations. Lincoln was just a log cutter. He used to cut logs and he became president of America. If America is great today, it's because of Lincoln, who laid the foundation. Gentlemen, it's food for thought. Let's not keep Nehru on a pedestal. Let us realize that Panditji was just an ordinary man. Somehow he became prime minister. That's a different thing, because he was a great Ji Hazuri of Gandhi, and Gandhi is another facet in Indian politics where we. So anyway, gentlemen, I close now and say, Jai Hind, glory to India. I hope you all like this video. A lot of facts are already known to people, but I thought I should put them from my angle. Do subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends, and come back for more. In the meanwhile, I'll say, gentlemen, goodbye, take care, and God bless.